So this recording focuses on designing and planning a questionnaire. It needs to be watched in conjunction with the general one on questionnaires and measurement scales, and also questionnaire administration. So what I'm going to do is I've got three key things that you need to think about when you're planning and designing a questionnaire. And the first of these is you need to plan your questions, and this is a really critical stage. Now, in order to do that, you need some objectives for your study, or if you don't have objectives, you need some very clear research questions. Whatever, you need to actually have really pinned down what it is you're trying to find out. Okay, so that could be by a list of objectives, or it could be a list of research questions. You then need, based on that, to write a list of information needed to achieve these objectives. So what do I need to find out in order to capture the data so that I can actually present some findings related to that objective? Now, I will also, when I do a session with you online, I will show you a handout that I've developed to help people plan their questionnaires, and that will help you here. So in order to think about what you need for these objectives, you need to go and have a look at the existing literature. Now, hopefully you've done the literature review at the stage that you're designing your questionnaire, and that literature review should help inform your list of information needs. Because, for instance, say you were looking at motivations, perhaps you were looking at motivations for undertaking a particular kind of tourism. You will be aware that there have been lots of motivational studies in tourism, and there are existing studies from which you can derive questions that have already been tried and tested in other questionnaires, and you can use these in your study. So if there are existing questions that come from another study that have been tried before and have been proven to work, you should be using them. You don't have to design your own. You can use other people's questions and questionnaires. You just need to reference that. So once you've got that list of information needs, and you've checked whether the literature can actually help inform that, decide what questions you need to ask, and then do a cross-check. Having got them, will these questions capture the data needed to address the objectives? Do some cross-checking. I often talk to students when they're looking at data analysis, and they're going, I want to look at this objective. How do I do this? And I'm going, well, you can't, because you didn't capture any data on one part of that objective. You haven't got a variable in your data set which captures that. And they kind of go, oh, yeah, I forgot to ask about people's age. So it's really important you do those cross-checking there. So I'll cover more about that in a face-to-face online session with you. Okay, and then the next thing is to plan your questionnaire out. Now, this, I recommend you use this process where there's 7 parts to a questionnaire. The first is identification data, which you might not need, because this is typically needed when you're actually distributing a questionnaire on site. So you're giving the questionnaire out in some format rather than it being delivered online. So in the kind of identification data you might need would be the date, time, place that the questionnaire has been given out, the interviewer's name if it's interview administered, and a respondent code. Now, if a questionnaire is distributed online, you don't have that information, and the respondents will be automatically coded by the system. But if you're giving it out on site, and particularly if you're giving it out on different sites, so in my PhD I gave out questionnaires at 4 different sites within a tourism destination, I needed to capture that information. Secondly, you need an introduction, really key, and there are ethical criteria that you need to address here as well. So this will come in when you've done your research ethics. So you need to state who you are, as the researcher or the person giving out the questionnaires. Tell them about who the research is for. In your dissertations, it's for your dissertation, and that's absolutely fine to say that. And actually, people are often quite positive about helping people with their dissertations. State the purpose of the questionnaire, what it's actually about, and make the respondents feel important. So the study really needs your support. It really needs your help, that kind of thing. Stress the confidential nature of the questionnaire. You shouldn't be collecting any, name, address, details, phone numbers, things like that. If though you have an incentive like this prize draw, you probably almost certainly have to capture something like a phone number or an email address in order to contact participants, but that needs to be destroyed after that process has been sorted out. Okay, and state the time requirement. How long will it take people to complete their questionnaire? Because actually people need to know this is going to take me 20 minutes or it's going to take me 2 minutes. It's quite a big difference. And then first part of your questionnaire, so we haven't actually asked any questions yet, but this might be the first question you ask, is any screening questions you need. So sometimes you have to check that the people completing the questionnaire are actually the right people you're looking for. So for example, perhaps you're doing some work about local residents' perspectives on live events that are taking place in the area. So you might need to check they are a resident and they're not actually a visitor. So you might say, are you a resident of Bournemouth? And if they say no, well then you just have a thank you message that says thank you very much. I'm afraid this questionnaire is for residents of Bournemouth, and they are tipped out the survey if it's online or if you're face-to-face, whatever, you thank them at that point. So you sometimes need screening questions just to check that people meet the criteria that you're looking for. And it's a surprising number of people who go into questionnaires who don't meet the criteria, even though it's been stated up front, because they're not reading that information. Then what we want to do after that, we want to begin with some nice, straightforward questions that people can answer just to get them going. Okay, so don't start off with something really complicated. Don't start off with something embarrassing that people don't like answering. So have easy questions at the start. I always say make sure they're questions that are obviously related to the topic. So don't ask people's age. I thought this questionnaire was about people's experience at the sport event today, and you're asking my age. What's that got to do with it? Ask them something about the topic that's very obviously related to the topic, and don't put them off at the start, because people will stop doing questionnaires if they feel like you're asking them things that are irrelevant. So generate into it, start with an easy question about whatever it is you're researching, so they can kind of see the link to the topic. Transition statements. So as you go through a questionnaire, you will obviously probably have a number of different sections focusing on different concepts or things that you want to measure to address your objectives. It's quite helpful to actually have some statements that sort of explain this to people. People don't necessarily read these, but it's just helpful that you can sort of say to people, for the next few questions, I want to ask you about your satisfaction with your experience at the restaurant today. And people kind of go, okay, right, I'm going to be asked about satisfaction now. And it just helps people through the questionnaire. Then complicated and difficult to answer questions. We tend to position these at the middle and towards the end of a questionnaire, because by this stage, the respondent, they're reasonably committed. They've answered a few questions. It's not been too bad. And they can see that there's not too many questions left. So if you're doing it online, there's usually a bar that shows people they're nearly, they're more than halfway through the questionnaire. If they're doing it as a paper-based one, they can see there's only a page to go or something. And so anything that's a little bit more challenging, put towards the end. And typically we record behaviour before asking attitude questions. And we explore present, our current behaviours, before looking at past behaviours or future behaviours. And remember, in one of my earlier recordings, I said there are issues asking people about the future, things that they might do in the future. Anything particularly embarrassing, leave towards the end. And be careful not to influence later questions by mentioning brands, products, etc. So if you're looking at, say your interest is in sports marketing, and you're looking at relationships between, say, a brand and a sports event, you might want to find out whether people have actually made the connection to the brand. Don't tell them what the brand is and then ask them that question later on. You need to kind of make sure that an earlier question hasn't already prompted them. And then any kind of classification data, so information about the person completing the survey, which we usually want something on this, because if nothing else, we might want to compare it to the national population to see if the sample's representative. or compare it to other data that might have been collected on the same topic, again to kind of check whether you've got a similar kind of sample. So put this last. I say usually last because there can be occasions where people might have a specific reason for asking this up front, but usually we put this last. So this might be things like people's employment status, whether they have children, etc., etc. And people don't like, for instance, having their age asked if that goes first. So I'd definitely put that kind of thing at the end. Okay, so that's those 7 phases. Then third, you've got to think quite carefully how you ask questions. So have a look at my first recording on the questionnaire generally, because I do raise some issues there about how you ask questions, and also what my recording on measurement scales. But these are, a few more reminders about what you need to think about. So generally closed rather than open questions. You want relatively few open questions, if at all. You need to think very carefully about the question wording so that it's not ambiguous, because that can mean you get really strange answers if people don't really understand it. Think about your answer options. Have you given them a full list of what the possible options? If you're not sure you've got a full list, do you need an other option? So for instance, I remember doing a survey about how people travelled in tourism to a particular tourism site, and I didn't include motorbike. Fortunately, I had another option, but actually people who came by motorbike were a little bit cross that motorbike hadn't been identified as a specific option. Now, fortunately, I found this out in the pilot study, and I included motorbike as one of the options. So, you need to kind of make sure you don't annoy accidentally a group of people by not including something that applies to them. You need to make sure categories don't overlap. So the classic one is age. So as you see there, I've got age 20 to 30, 30 to 40. Which option does the 30-year-old tick? Do they think they're in the 30 to 40 category or the 20 to 30 category? So you just need to be careful, because it's a very common mistake to have overlapping categories, which is always awkward for someone who falls on that overlap. Give careful instructions. So if there's a number of options, so, which facilities have you used at the venue today? And, there are things like toilets, restaurant, balcony seating area, whatever. Do they tick all that apply or tick the most important? And you might have a slightly different way you ask the question. And that has some implications for data analysis as well. So it's worth a little bit of thought about that and some discussion with the supervisor about that. And as I mentioned earlier, do you need, I mentioned this on the measurement scales, do you need not applicable answer options? And think about the different measurement scales you can use. So that should give you plenty to think about there. And you now need to go and watch the recording on questionnaire administration.